Just one thing before we do jump into today's show, and that is my Beyond the Game newsletter. Would you enjoy getting a short email from me every Friday that provides something to stoke your curiosity before the sporting weekend? Hundreds of parents, coaches, and community sport leaders subscribe to my free newsletter called Beyond the Game. Basically, it includes a short insight from me that I've been pondering during the week, a key finding from the latest research I've been reading, as well as a cool idea from one of the inspiring minds who come on this podcast. It's all designed to help you support your athletes to be the very best that they can be. So, if that sounds fun, again, it's very short, just a little goodness before you dive into your busy weekend of sport. If you'd like to try it out, just head over to athletedevelopmentproject.com/newsletter. Type in your email and you'll get the very next one. Cool. Thanks for listening. Kia ora and welcome to the Athlete Development Show podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Craig Harrison, sports scientist, coach, and researcher focused on the developing athlete. It's an absolute pleasure to bring Golf New Zealand's national coach, Jay Carter, on the show. Jay and I met not long ago when he reached out to ask me on his fantastic podcast, Talking Performance. We had such a great conversation and barely scratched the surface on some topics I just wanted to talk more about. So here we are. While Jay and I spend our days in different sports and with athletes at different stages of development, we share a lot in common. Most significantly, the common goal to help athletes lead themselves. Jay and I cover a lot in this conversation, including solving problems over learning techniques, identifying potential rather than performance, creating talent systems, play versus practice, what happened when Jay literally froze on the tee back in his playing days, thinking out loud to build mental skills, slowing down to speed up, and much more. We start the conversation hearing from Jay and what he does with New Zealand's aspiring golfers.
If you look at golf and how it's practiced, oftentimes, particularly in bigger cities, on a driving range which is perfectly linear, like everything is built square, off a mat that is not representative of even grass. If you mishit it on a mat, you can still get good outcomes. Generally speaking, to no specific target, and you're hitting the same club over and over again, which is not like golf at all. You're never hitting the same club twice unless you've hit it out of bounds. And that's obviously not ideal. And then from a learning point of view, the learning of the skill in golf is often everything defaults back to swing technique. As in, right. What position were my hands in here, and they need to be there because, I don't know, the best player in the world at the moment does this, so therefore I should do this. And so that's never really sat well with me. Even as a player, I was coached that way. And and that's the way that's the norm in golf. And so the coaching, I guess, that I do, or that I kind of have to do because I'm the secondary service provider, so I don't need to go in and talk about golf swings, is actually the stuff that I love doing because it's the stuff that interests me, is the training environments and skill acquisition in many ways. Like, golf, I guess, is considered a closed skill if people still talk about closed and open skills. And I think everybody, I don't know, I don't think it's that, like, everything's changing all the time, that you never play off a flat lie on a golf course, but everything on a driving range is a flat lie. Like, I think if you were trying to stuff up a training environment, they've pretty much nailed it, how we've created most golf training environments. It is getting better. So yeah, that's the sort of stuff that interests me. And I think that would be the perception of golf lessons, as you go to a lesson, get told what you did, 15 things that you're doing wrong and what you need to change. And then, I don't know, do people get better from that? I don't know.
It is interesting because it equates a little bit to training in the gym. We're, for a long time, strength and conditioning, which is my background. I've diversified over the last little while in my interests mainly. But yeah, that very much has come out of a narrative of there's a right way of doing it. And to a certain extent, I think like we probably need to we need to stick with some of that tradition around movement and how bones work. But the learning is interesting because there's a fundamental component to what you do in the gym to strengthen, the musculoskeletal system. But there's also this piece that transfers into sport, which is really interesting, and how much of it is our job in the gym to create that versus, the head coach when they get back onto the court or back onto the field or, in your case, back onto the grass, the greens. So yeah, it's been through a bit of a journey in terms of how much representative design we're going to include when it comes to developing the body.
Yeah.
It's still not 100% clear in my head as to or at least I probably use both in a mix of things based on what I see. So how does that show up in your world? Are you getting athletes coming to you with specific problems? Is that the bulk of your work, or are you looking at what they're doing and just finding ways of improving them, like the 1% and 2%ers?
Yeah, probably that. I mean, the reality is most of the young players that I work with are highly skilled. And in terms of, often say, the golf is the easy bit. And so you are looking for marginal gains across the whole game. One of the things, I guess, potentially good about golf is heaps of data. It's really easy to collect data, even for amateur players, because, you can just record every shot you hit now with either GPS or after the round. So, and then we can use those metrics either against any benchmark we like, really. So it's sort of hard to hide for any of our players. So it'll show up where their gaps are. I guess my biggest challenge would be a lot of the players will have that narrative in their head that they just need to make my swing more consistent, right. With the view that that'll give them more consistent results. Whereas my thinking, I had a guy, Jonah Oliver, on the podcast, and he's a sports psychologist, works with Cameron Smith, who's one of the best golfers in the world, among other Australian athletes. And he said something along the lines of, in terms of pressure, his job is not to reduce pressure, but for his athletes, but to increase their capacity to be able to handle the pressure. And so I sort of took a bit of a play on that recently, and I've thought about my job, and our purpose of practice is to increase the player's capacity to handle the stresses that come with tournament golf. And so if I go back to the example I used before, we'll see a lot of our young golfers practicing with music on and, headphones. And the simple question of, are you increasing your capacity, whether that be mental, physical, tactical, technical, like which one are you, if any of them, are you, is your capacity being challenged or growing? So yeah, anyway, I think probably just that bit around growing capacity to be able to handle the stress. And so our training needs to look like that. So I guess the challenge for me is, how can I help our young players, even because it's a hard conversation to have when our sport has a history of, but the best players in the world do it this way, or, X and Y does it this way. Who's to say that what I think is right? And that's a fair question. But yeah, so changing that, or even getting them to just think outside the square a little bit, can be challenging. Doing something different to how your peers are doing it.
Yeah, interesting, how those narratives of sport hold true for a long time. And so where do you go with that? Like, where would you start with an athlete? And the reason I ask is because I'm interested in probably the stage of development preceding when you're starting to pick some of these kids up. And so it's important for us to think about some of the pieces of the puzzle that we can set athletes up for, regardless of the environment, be it golf or soccer or whatever, in a way that I think introduces them to some of these ideas, so that if they do in fact make it to the next level, then they're not starting from scratch. I'm just starting a piece of work which looks at the scaffolding of these competencies through the stages of development. It's something that I'm doing more and more of, and so I'm always interested in, what I can learn from you guys that are at that next stage.
It's an interesting one, and I guess probably throwing it back a little bit to you, but things that interest me in this are when we're young and we love a sport, we're often really playful and curious with the way we go about stuff. Like I think of, in golf, around the chipping green, you see kids hitting the most amazing shots and trying stuff, and they put their own rules in. They'll say, we're having a closest to the pin competition, but your ball has to land at least this far onto the green. And so they work out, they do these crazy things. I remember doing that as a kid with my mates. And, my dad would go, you need to practice properly. You're mucking around too much. And I thought I was too, because I was having fun. I thought I was mucking around. I was literally like, yeah, right, sorry, I better practice. But in actual fact, now thinking, no, I was doing two things then. I was probably increasing my bandwidth of skill. I was growing my love of the game. And then ironically, by practicing the way that I thought I was meant to, I reckon I was de-skilling myself and lowering my love of the game. And so what I think we see with young players, and we're guilty of this massively, is a player gets into our national program purely on the fact that they are good and they're talented and they have no systems and no structures behind them. And we're all there going, oh, cool, man, that's great. You need some systems and structures. And so we bombard them with stuff. So they might come in at 18 and then by 20, we try not to do this, by the way. So,
right.
Then by 20, they're like, man, this now feels like a job. It doesn't actually feel like a game anymore. And I guess and I think about that. I remember saying to you, and I had you on talking about Alan Bunting, and, I asked him what he did because he was just good at everything. He's like, I just played in the backyard with my mates. And so did I, but I wasn't good at everything. I was competent, but I wasn't like him. But I think there's a part of that backyard play that's critical that's been removed. And where in the week are we growing the love for young players, regardless of the sport? The reality is that, we're talking about 0.01% of players who are actually probably going to make it to be an all black, a black cap, an all white, a silver fern, a PGA Tour player. And the real gutting thing for me with golf is I've got heaps of mates who are scratch handicap, like let's say obviously really good golfers, don't play golf and they hate it. And I think,
right,
man, that sucks. We've done something wrong there to be that skillful at something. And, if I say, do you want to go out for a game of golf? I could not think of anything worse. And then you're like, fundamentally, we've stuffed something up massively there. And I've been in that position as a young player when I was still competing, and I'd go home and Dad would say, should we go out for a game? And I'd go, no chance. I'd rather poke my eyes with hot sticks. And then this is the bit back to you would be, how many times do you have parents who are high performance athletes and they have kids and their biggest desire for their kid is that they just love sport. They don't care how good they get. I've never heard a high performing parent go, I want my daughter to be desperate for her to be a silver fern, or I'm desperate for her. They always just go, I just want them to love it. And then you think, okay, so what is that about? Like, would you want them to go through what you went through?
It's interesting, like to be able to get the balance right between all of the research around deliberate practice and the need to get the reps in order to develop expertise, which I'm not sure that we can debate that literature. It's pretty strong. But at the same time, this other piece of the importance of it, of having joyful moments and it to be a passion and ultimately playing the game for life. That's the challenge. And perhaps we don't spend enough time working with our kids to help them to understand the pieces of the environment that allow them to achieve X outcome versus Y outcome. And so all of a sudden there's a narrative that says you must put the reps in and enjoy it, as opposed of like what actually brings you joy And it's important that we have X amount of time during the week where you go and do that, and creating space for that without neglecting the importance of getting the reps. Then they become empowered to be able to play within that space, and constantly having conversations with us about, well, what do you need? I feel like I need a little bit of joy this week because I've just been grinding for so long. Okay, sweet. Well, let's create space to do that. And how would, you like to be a part of that? And then they'll probably go back to those examples that you mentioned around backyard play, essentially.
Yeah.
Is that the part for you? Like, do you have to create space to have those conversations with these kids to help them to recognize some of the other pieces of the puzzle, of the high performance puzzle, in order to really be their best over time?
Yeah, I would say the repetition for us isn't a massive hurdle because it's easy to get the reps in for most players. And I think it's easy again because I don't think they engage that. And this is a broad statement, right? But with headphones in, if you think about, if you said to most people working an office job, do you want to go and practice golf? You just stand there and hit balls listening to music. Most people would go, yeah, man, that sounds like a holiday. But deep, deliberate practice where you have got an intent and you've got a target and, you've got outcome and consequence and you're learning from it, that actually takes a lot of mental energy. So I think the thing for me is I've been trying to play around with, to your point before, of just have intent with what you're doing. So one of the things in golf, like a 4-foot putt, most of our players would get pretty close to 100% of the four, it'd be 99 sort of percent of those. Hitting the same 4-foot putt over and over again from a skill acquisition point of view, in my opinion, does nothing for your skill acquisition. You're not going to really get better. That is the whole repetition with repetition in that situation. But what I will say to them is if your intent is like Ed Colan will talk about, practice being bored. So in that case, use it as a mind gym, as in hit 100 putts from 4 feet. Understand that you're not going to necessarily improve your skill of putting from 4 feet, but now you're improving your capacity to handle the mental demands of the boredom. So I think for a while there, I was probably a little bit too dogmatic with everything has to be random and everything has to be representative. And now probably saying to the players, I don't mind what you do, but can you back up what you're doing and tell me how it's improving your capacity and which part is it? And then I guess trying to help them or both of us come up with ideas as to what could we do to make this more like golf, or some of the stresses that, because golf can be boring. You're out there for 5 hours. A lot of the time is the space in between shots.
Yeah, I really like that idea, helping them to sort of create that awareness around not only what they're doing in the moment, but also the things that they need, day to day in order to continue to get better. So how do you go about the awareness piece, right? So an athlete comes in, you sit them down and you talk to them about their strengths and their weaknesses. Are they good at articulating that to you? Can they reel that off? And then do they have processes in place that they can then go and use to start making progress in those areas?
Yes and no. So as I said with data, I think it's easy, accessible, and it's relatively accurate. The limitations that come with it are like every player, every round they play, I can literally go onto our data platform and look at where they hit it from, what the lie was like, how far they had, where the pin was, what they were trying to do, what they did do. But what it doesn't tell me is how they were feeling in that moment. Were they running 30th and therefore no pressure and they were just freewheeling it and life was easy? Or were they one shot ahead and really feeling under the pump and heart rate was elevated? So it doesn't give you too much, or was it into the wind? Was it raining? Doesn't give you a lot of that context. But with that data and then you got the floor of averages as well. But with that data, players will have a fairly good understanding of where they're at. I guess my biggest challenge would be the default is always, it must have been my swing. Once I get my swing right. And I guess my retort to that would be, well, you shot 65 the day before. How was your swing that day? Like, did you think it changed that dramatically that you were 8 shots worse today? And so the challenge I would say is even just things like, and whether it's accurate enough or not, again, you'd be the expert here, but like Whoop data, it's enough to have players understand that, their recovery might not have been that great, or their recovery was great and they still didn't play well. I'm not a fan of going, I've woken up in the red, I'm going to play badly today, because golf's not like that. But we don't have this linear progression of improvement in golf. It's I think quite complex. So I'd be loath with a player to say, it would have been this. But I love the players being, and I feel like I've got a good relationship now with our national squad because they've all been part of it for a while, where I think they genuinely now believe me when I ask them questions. I do say to them, if there's a question I'm asking you and I've got the answer, I'm just going to tell you. I'm not interested in the question where I've got the answer and I'm just waiting for you to give it to me. So I think now they genuinely believe that I'm curious and I want to hear their perspective on things, and I don't have the answers. And I think it's a hard thing for some of them to come, like, you're the coach, you should have the answers. That's what you're here for. So that's probably my biggest challenge when it comes to reviewing that, and that takes time.
So that point you made about asking questions is interesting. I was assessing some third-year coaching students in our AUT program just the other day. And part of the education is around questioning for understanding, using questions in order to facilitate some reflective thinking. But most of the questions they ask are, like you said, ones that they already have the answer to. I'm just interested in understanding why that's not a useful process for you.
When I have the answer, you mean?
Yeah, when you have the answer and you say, well, actually, I'm not going to ask a question that I have the answer to. I'm just going to tell you.
Yeah.
Because that's a really interesting distinction that I haven't given much thought to. I'd just love to dig into it a little bit more.
Because I think because I used to do it, and I used to have players get frustrated and just go, mate, I know you know where you're going with this. Just tell me.
Right.
And there's times when I'll still prod them to come up, but I feel like it's more of a discussion then. But what I think the main reason is I feel like it erodes the trust, so that when I do have a genuine question and I do want to work something out with them, or even have them be playful and try stuff, I don't have that trust because they think that every question I ask them, I have the answer to. So I think it's important that I model that I haven't got the answer. I often say to them, which obviously it's not my work, but you're the expert of you. You know you better than I do. I'm just here to hopefully ask you some questions that'll make you think about you a bit more. But if all my questions are loaded with an answer and a correct outcome, then every time I ask a question, you've got your guard up. And so I don't actually get what I want out of it, and you don't get what you want out of it. We both lose. So that's my theory.
Yes. Yeah, it's super interesting. So when it comes to technical feedback, if you see something in the swing that arguably is wrong, whether that exists or not, I'm not sure. That's probably another topic. But if you see it and you're trying to work on something, then that feedback will be direct instruction to fix it, or this is what I saw.
Yeah. And if I've got the strong enough relationship, as in if I've known them long enough. So the other thing I'm conscious of is if we have players that come into the National Academy and they're new, they'll have their own coach. And the worst thing I can do is say anything really about their technique. Even if I agree with their coach, I'll say it in a different way. So the player will hear it differently and then go back to their coach and say, Jay said this, and their coach will go, that's not right. And so then we've got conflict, and the player's the one that loses out of that because, he's thinking, God, who do I listen to? But over time, if I usually get to the point where the coaches will say, mate, just jump in if you think you see anything happy as to for it, and the players will say that as well. So in that case, I will potentially, but I'll try and always link it back to what the ball flight is doing and what's the problem that we're trying to solve here. Because golfers will get, I'm not sure if this is a normal thing in other sports, but they'll send a video of their swing and say, oh, it's to this or it's to that. But you're like, what? Tell me what the ball's doing, because that's the game, not your swing. But no, it doesn't look right.
Right.
So I won't engage in those conversations. But if I can see something that they're doing, as I said, we've got plenty of data. We've got 3D Doppler radars that track the club and the ball. So, like you can hit a shot and there'll be 30 parameters telling you how many degrees your face was open or closed, or what your path was, and your launch angle and your attack angle, and how much spin you had on the ball. So it tells us everything. So that can be pretty hard to argue with. And then it becomes around the preference of how you work that. And so it might be, working with you, if we were using TrackMan, which is what the unit's called. So, Craig, we know this has gone that way because of these 3 factors. That's physics or geometry. This is what I see in your swing that I think contributes to that. What do you reckon? And then if we've got that relationship, they'll be like, no, but I hate that feel because doing that makes it feel like this. Whereas if I haven't got that trust around, let's do this together, they'll just do what I say for that moment while they're in front of me. And then when they go home, they're like that. Or I'd rather they were open and said, I hate that feeling. It brings back this feeling, or it does this. And you're like, cool. Well, we've got some objective data that we can work to here. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really useful. Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about instances in youth sport where kids are playing in multiple teams with multiple coaches, or a different coach for every team, right?
Mm.
And I would imagine that I've seen it happen where the information coming from one coach compared to a different coach is conflicting. And so how would you think about that problem in a space of, say, volleyball or football, for example, where kids are showing up in multiple environments over the course of a week and getting information that is confusing at best?
Yeah.
Because it happens a lot, and I'm always interested in how we can solve those types of problems, because I think if anything, we get a lot of noise and a lot of inefficiencies just because of the information coming in is conflicting a lot of the time in lots of different ways. What I would say is my thinking around this is that it has to come back to the athlete, and they have to be the filter, but that's a really, really hard thing for a 14-year-old to do, for lots of reasons that I've talked about before on the pod. But I'm just curious, how would you think about going about solving that problem, or attempting to solve that problem?
Yeah, it is a hard one, because you've also got that hierarchy of coaching. Like my school coach said it, my club coach said it, now the rep coach said it, the national coach said it. Like, you're probably going to listen to the last one because he's,
that's right.
I guess the advantage that we have is we're trying to, because we're not centralized. One thing that COVID or the lockdown sort of era taught us was that we can do a lot of stuff digitally. We could do a better job of digitalizing stuff. And so we have a sort of a theme where we try and create digital centralization to say, well, we don't have to be in front of each other all the time. In fact, in many ways, not all centralized environments actually end up working. There's plenty of dysfunctional centralized programs, and there's functional ones as well. But I'd love to get your thoughts on centralization too, actually. Thankfully, the player in our game is at the center. So we use an app called Coach Now, and it basically stores everything. So if I'm coaching you, or if you're in our national program, I'll upload your data from our work into Coach Now, which your home coach will be on, your physio will be on, your S&C will be on. So it's all about you. Whereas I guess in those other sports like football or volleyball, it's all about the team. And so that the athlete's transitioning through, I guess, multiple teams, which makes it harder. Whereas for us, the athlete is at the center because he is the or she is the thing.
So, I mean, even that in and of itself is a really interesting idea, and how we potentially could revolutionize youth sport a little bit around doing that, like putting the child in the middle, in the center of things, as opposed in team sport, as you suggested, it's traditionally been about the team and very little about the needs of the child. And the biggest question that I will always get, and that I'm struggling with as much as anyone in my boys' football team, is being able to provide experiences that are appropriately challenged to every individual in the team. When the variability, I think we spoke about this on your podcast, is just becoming greater and greater. So you'll get one kid, in the team who practices for hours in the backyard and turns up and has an ability that surpasses everyone else in the team by quite a lot. And then you'll get someone else who, just wants to have a bit of a laugh with his mates. And there's no disrespect in terms of wanting to get better, but just is on a different point of the progression curve. And so as a coach, it's like, how do we create an environment to suit? Because as I said, that's probably the biggest question that I get asked. Like, how do I do that when I've got 10 kids in the group? And so I think that's going to be the problem that we're going to face more and more, and it's just going to get harder and harder because kids are getting further and further away from the norm.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest problems of youth sport is, what do you hang your hat on from a coaching point of view to make sure that every child is getting a positive experience?
Yeah.
Because it's really not easy.
No. It's it takes an incredible amount of skill, coaching skill, I think, to achieve that. I may have said it when we chatted about Russell Earnshaw, or Rusty Earnshaw, who has the Magic Academy pod. He came out to New Zealand and did some coach development stuff. And watching him coach was honestly a masterclass. He was doing things, he ran around with the players for starters. He was laughing and commentating with them, but he did things like, one kid, it was rugby, but one kid it was an awesome player. He appeared to be slightly ahead of everybody else. And one of the games they were doing involved, you didn't score a try, you had to either put a grubber kick or a kick into the either corner of your or the opposition half to get the point. And so the kid that was dominating, Rusty just said to him in a lovely way, right, I'm going to develop your skill and grow you as a player. You can only kick with your left foot now. And then they were playing touch, and he had a couple of headbands, and if you were wearing a headband and you got touched, it was immediate turnover, because there was some players that, like whatever the reason was, whether they were either highly skilled or they too much of a hamu. But so he was just constantly just evolving and developing the game he was observing, he was interacting with the game, he was picking up stuff. He wasn't going to a script. He didn't know what was going to happen, obviously. He didn't know any of the kids. He was the first time he'd coached them. He was doing things like, close your eyes, all right, freeze, close your eyes. And then you had to put your hand up if you knew where the fullback was in the opposition team. And, one guy in the back line puts the fullback, and then he has a little bit of a chat about that. Would that be useful to know? And if you don't know, if you do know and they're made inside you, would that be helpful to tell them? And just these beautiful little conversations throughout the game. The bits, like one guy ran a line and did a dummy pass and scored. And, Rusty said, great try, but who was the hero of that move? And after a bit of conversation, it was the kid that ran the line that allowed the guy to score the try to do the dummy pass. But you could see these light bulbs going off for these kids. But Rusty's been coaching for over many years. So how do you you watch him and go, man, I want to be coached by him. That looks fun. Everyone's getting challenged at different levels. But man, that's a skillful coach. And mum and dad who have just been thrown under the bus because no one else puts their hand up and they've rushed from work and thought, oh, I don't even know anything about netball. What am I going to do? Quickly go on YouTube. But that's the X's and O's of coaching, not the actual, the gritty bit of coaching.
Absolutely. And it's also the management of the team. Like, it's team first. Like, we just need the team to be working in a way that a team works, and then we're winning, as opposed to your example where I think it's more about, well, I actually need every individual working in a way that works for them, and the group kind of benefits because of it. Like, it's a conversation that a good friend, Dan Cook, who's a football coach, we're having more and more of. Coaching in these spaces is more about the individual than it is about the team in team sports. And then you might have a bit of a speech on Saturday around the tactics, and the team goes out there and plays. But the coaching during the week and the feedback, on the sideline is to the individual. And it makes sense, I think, because of the need for a sense of belonging, but also a sense of, but what about me?
Yeah.
And I think if anything in youth sport these days, and I think it's the same regardless, is it's just the desire to be seen and the desire to have something that's created for me, as individualistic as that sounds. It's a fundamental human need, isn't it? Super challenging to do well, though.
Yeah. What's your take on the athletes? I remember this young golfer that I knew, but he's a professional athlete now, and he was good. To my point before, a little bit, he was just good at everything, but didn't really care. And every sport he did, everyone wanted him to be the next New Zealand champ. And, you should be working harder, and you should be doing this, and you should be doing that. But he just liked playing. And he didn't necessarily want to be. It was all of our dreams for him to be these things. And you'd get frustrated with him and like, he should be doing, he's got this gift. But he didn't care. He just wanted to play. So what's your thoughts on that? And I was guilty of it with him.
It's a hard one, and it's like I'm thinking on the spot a little bit, because it's not something that I have something in my back pocket for. But I would probably start at trying to hold back from projecting, as you said, my aspirations onto someone who doesn't hold them for himself or herself. Because we do that in so many different ways. I saw that a lot over summer, just on summer holiday, around parents projecting emotion onto kids, living not vicariously through our kids, but in a way that we want the best for them, and therefore we pass these emotions onto them before they get an opportunity to live them for themselves. And I'm standing on the sideline watching my kids play. It's like, but if only they did a little bit more of this, then they'd be able to do more of that on the field, right? And you have to be very intentional about holding that back.
Yeah.
But in saying that, it's also, like, I think about creating environments or situations that evoke the curiosity. And I may have mentioned this on your podcast, but I think that's our job, is how do we create that type of environment that says, and to a kid like that just wants to play, all of a sudden they might have a question or a problem that they really want to solve, but might not necessarily have the solution. And at that point, they might choose to step forward and ask the question. And until that happens, perhaps, it's not something that we should force. Balancing that with the team is always a hard one too, because that's where I think conversations around what is the shared expectation here, what are we getting ourselves into, is an important conversation. If it comes down to a group of people that are trying to work towards a shared dream or a shared goal, because then you get those players that if they're not contributing, potentially a thorn in the side, so to speak. Yeah, I don't know. What about you? What do you think around players that just want to play? I mean, do you have any that show up in the golfing world?
Not probably not at the probably not the space where I work in. This young fellow that I was thinking about, he got to a scratch handicap probably within a year, which is pretty unheard of. But yeah, I guess it's a fine line between the talent and that's really interesting me at the moment. Actually, is talent and what is it? I think I've done multiple loops on that one around. Going through that, you can just do 10,000 hours and everything's going to be, you'll be good sort of mindset, and going, okay, there's no such thing as talent. We just got to work hard, but then thinking, well, I reckon I worked harder than some of my mates and they were better than me, so that doesn't quite stand true. And then, what is it that we're really looking for here for golf? If we have 10 players now, National Academy every year-ish. There's not a set number. It's how many have qualified. So if we have 10 players in the academy every year, and over the last 20 years, let's say we've had 200. Well, we have Danny Lee, Ryan Fox, Dan Hillier, and Lydia Ko on major tours around the world. And then we've got a couple underneath that with Amelia Garvey and Momoka Kobori. But even then, you're like, well, there's 6 players out of the 200 that made it to the National Academy. And there probably wouldn't be 200, but 150, say. So what are we doing? What else are we doing other than golf? We're certainly not wanting to it's that balance of not wanting to put them off, but wanting them to be aware that you're on the journey, you're on the ladder, but there's a few rungs above you, and talent will get you. It's almost like, what's that saying? Talent gets you in the dressing room, but it's about, it doesn't keep you in there, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I guess that probably that edge around, yeah, you're on track, but you're still a long way away, and there's a lot of work to be done. And being honest with players around that. And so that's why if you do get that player, I've started to realise that now the behavioural stuff's critical. In the past, I would have gone, oh, everyone can make it. That you just got to work hard and you'll be fine. Whereas now I've probably got a better understanding and just think, if you're not going to work hard, you're probably not going to make it. And I'm not sure how much energy I'm going to invest in that athlete, because that's a critical part of the puzzle. And so if the kid that just does want to play, I'm pretty open with them now and going, that's cool, man, just play. And you might make it, but it's not for me to say you will or you won't, whether you practice hard or you don't.
It's a tough one, isn't it, when you create systems that the entry criteria to the system is based on performance, because you might quite easily get a kid like that who, meets all of the entry criteria, but has no real substance to how he got there, at least from a behavioural point of view. For whatever reason, the stars have collided and he's good enough to get in the door.
Yeah.
Which, all power to you, right? But as you suggested, it's the behavioural stuff that keeps you there over time. And like at the pointy end of sport, it kind of comes down to that, doesn't it? When you're investing a whole bunch of money into a program and you need it to sustain over time, then you need some sort of you got to hedge your bets, don't you? And it's like, what are you going to bet on?
Yeah.
And so those behavioural things, and that's really interesting, because that would show up in some players, quite clearly in a development environment. And in other players, they'll be miles off. And thinking about how much, like, do you select? Like, what do you select on? Just going through some of the criteria for this sport that I'm helping at the moment. things like curiosity, right? An inner drive to actually seek out information, to turn over the stones that are yet to be turned. Do you select for that? Or even can you afford to select for that? Or are you just selecting the best players, knowing that's a characteristic that's arguably crucially important over time if kids are gonna, or if athletes are gonna stay in the system.
Yeah,
But in some sports we don't have that luxury, do you? I mean, I'm not sure whether you have it in golf, but there's plenty of sports in New Zealand where, if you're gonna put a team on the world stage, or if you're gonna send, an athlete even to an age group event, then you kind of have to send the best players.
Yeah. The good thing for us is we work in, I guess, pre-elite or talent development. So Lydia Ko, Ryan Fox, they're elite in terms of the golfing world. So they've come through our system and are now doing it on their own, just as the nature of the sport. And, Foxy, I don't know how old he is, mid-30s. And he's at his peak now. And most of the players I'm dealing with are between sort of 16 and 22. So there's a massive gap there between what happens next. So to get into the program, you need to have a fair bit of golfing skill. But yeah, we call out some of those behaviours and characteristics, and hopefully we're evolving and understanding what it means, because I travel a lot with the teams, which I think is lovely because you get an insight into the person more so than just in a session, in a training session where they can behave well and say all the right things. And when you travel with someone for a couple of weeks, you sort of start to, it's hard to put on an act for 2 weeks. But I must admit, initially the box tickers were sort of the ones that I'd go, oh yeah, he's going to make it because he does everything right, or she does all the good stuff. But you soon realize that a lot of those people are doing it because you think they should. And then I had this surprise thing of, occasionally it's these outliers that are the ones that are actually more likely to make it. And I chatted with Frank Nobilo, who's one of our best ever golfers and commentates in the US. And he said, I don't envy your job because you've got to create a system that supports 99% of the population, but also gives that 1% enough room, because that one outlier, the reality is in our sport, that's probably your guy or your girl, but you can't build your system around him or her because they're a little bit different and they might not tick all the boxes that you want them to tick. And it's, if you think about it, Foxy's different in a lovely way. He hasn't come through the traditional golf pathway, and this is one thing, probably on a massively different tangent, but people will go, why is Foxy so good? And I mean, I don't know if I did, I'd be selling it to everybody else. But one thing I think is interesting is he grew up in a household with an All Black great, and he was, as a kid, exposed, he's probably going into All Black changing rooms and having conversations at dinner tables that are different to the conversations that I had growing up with my mum and dad, who beautiful people, hardworking, so you can say, oh, Foxy's he's just a naturally good golfer. Yeah, maybe he's a naturally good sportsman, but equally he's had however long he was living at home for, his mum and dad, who are highly successful people in their own right, having conversations which are just, whirring away in the background of him. Like, how much of an impact has that had? And we can never measure that, but people might look at his swing and go, oh, well, if Foxy does that, I'm going to do that. Like, yeah, but you haven't grown up with the conversations that he's had for 20 years and all that stuff, I think. So, like a teacher at school who took you aside and invested in you, what impact has that actually had? And we don't know that when we bring a player into a national camp or an academy. We don't know all that background about them. And I think it's massively important.
It's a super interesting area for conversation. And there's a guy, Wade Gilbert, who I had on my podcast a long time ago, Canadian. I don't know if you've come across his work, but yeah, he's done a little bit around normalizing excellence, and he talked to that idea of like it's just the way that we live our life, but the way that Ryan Fox lives his is substantially different to the way that you would live yours, right?
Yeah.
And so I want to go back to that idea of the outlier, because that's a really interesting one, and I talk with a friend all the time about this idea, and he recently reshaped a little bit of the way I think about development. His perspective was, we need to stop selecting on performance and we need to select on potential. And the only way you can do that is to have people that are very, very good at seeing potential. And that's a completely different skill set than performance. So to dig into that a little bit more, how that fleshed out in terms of the mechanics of systems is, if you think about most sporting pathways, they're not necessarily linear, but they start with big numbers at the bottom, and over time athletes fall out of the system as we start selecting them into programs, and if they're not good enough, then they fall away. Now, regardless of how much entry and exit points we have along the way, the reality is that over time the amount of people in the system reduces, and then at some point we go, right, now we're going to select our high performance program from this point forth. Depending on the sport, that changes with age. And so then we have to think about how we create those environments over time to service creating high performance athletes versus kids that just want to play the game. And that's a really tricky thing. But when you're selecting for potential, what you do is you just service all of the kids, and it's developmental, and you completely forget about high performance until, right at the pointy end of the stick where you get someone that can see potential, and they come in and they look into this huge pool of kids that are just enjoying playing the game, and they say, I want you and I want you. And if they're good at seeing potential, then all of a sudden you've got a high performance program of 2 individuals, and you invest everything you've got into them. And most likely those are going to be the outliers. And not the outliers in kind of a funky, weird way, just the outliers in the high performance way.
Yeah.
Because I would imagine in a sport like golf and in many other sports, like the high performers are outliers.
Yeah.
As by way of definition, right? It's like exactly. Elisa Carrington. And this is why I think like balance is better is a little bit frustrating in telling stories of these outliers. Because I think it's good in the sense of, some of the ideas of play lots of sports. Yeah, Elisa Carrington did. Yeah, that's cool, but Elisa Carrington is an outlier. She's not normal.
Yeah, yeah.
and I think we all know that, right? So, but it is interesting into looking to what makes her different, because that's the $1 million question, I think. So anyway, yeah, it's a different way of thinking about how we create our systems, and so to make that really tangible, like in football, for example, we start in lots of sports. We start selecting kids into pathways from the age of 12, and then 14, and then 15, but why don't we just play? And then at 17 or 18, we go, now we're going to pick our 20s team. We forget about everything that comes before it.
Yeah. That is super interesting.
It needs a lot more work. It needs a lot more thought, but and exactly what that would look like. So to give you an example, right, like athletics, they came up with this really cool new idea of launch athletics. It was a new competition structure, and I had the community athletics development on the lady on the podcast a little while ago, and so she described it and talked about it, and it was getting a whole bunch of 14 to 17-year-olds together to compete in a teams event for points in order to win for the team, and all of the competition or all of the events that were held on the night were of unique distances or the conditions around the event were not normal. So they had I think they had a 50 meter or a 300 or a 1K, like those types of events that you wouldn't see in a traditional athletics meeting.
Yeah.
And it was held at night, and there was music, and anyway, it went really, really well. Lots of interest. But the funny thing is the kids that are in, the high performers at nationals from a secondary school point of view, they didn't go.
Right.
Because from at least from what I understand, they were thinking that was just a little bit naff. It wasn't it's not what I need to be doing in order to make the next stage of the high performance pathway.
Yeah.
And so it's just interesting how we've created these narratives that certain kids buy into based on the outcomes that they're looking to achieve. When in actual fact, that event would have been hugely beneficial from a developmental point of view for all of those kids to be involved in, working in teams, being able to try new things in environments of less pressure, exploring, themselves in environments where there's less on the line, like all of that sort of stuff, absolute gold. But they didn't give themselves the chance because they didn't show up.
Yeah.
Anyway,
so much stuff there that I
digress a little bit.
I want to talk about a few things there. One is the potential thing. Do you think there's a danger in what I notice in someone appeases my desires and my beliefs and what someone else? So I might go, yeah, they've got potential because, they're a bit of a maverick and they do this and that, and I like that. And then a colleague might go, oh, that person's got potential because they make their bed before. And I'm like, I don't care if they make their bed. So are you biased by your own preferences and beliefs? The second part is I think about that with being challenged to create this this picture of performance, like how can we identify, I guess, these young players, and I just go, I don't know where to start, but thinking of a couple of players in particular that you can point to and go, yep, they're good, and they're going to be good, and they'll go, what is it about them? I'm like, actually, I'm not sure that I can completely put my finger on it, but there's something, and that's the danger of the mess, which I'd love to get your point on.
But that's that's high performance, isn't it? Like that is the risk that we take. But when we create systems, we play it safe. But in actual fact, giving you the opportunity, who's been in golf for a long time and arguably has earned his stripes, to have a crack at picking the potential is a very courageous decision to whoever's giving you that power. But it might mean that you struck it lucky because for whatever reason you can put your finger on something that you can't necessarily articulate. But now we are very much in a world where we have to justify every decision that we make based on certain types of assessments, metrics, what have you, so that we know where all the dollars being spent, right?
Yeah, well, I just thought then actually have this with skill with a few players that can. One particular thing I talk about a bit on my podcast is this one time I asked this kid, he wasn't a kid, he was probably early 20s, but I said to him, he's a professional, and I said, how did you hit that shot? It was a fascinating shot, and he was with a group of our juniors at the time. I said, how did you hit that, mate? Like, it'd be so cool to teach them. And he sort of swung his club a few times, and he went, I sort of just I just sort of throw my hands at it. And like, that's horrendous advice. But and it always struck me that he didn't even know. And then I think it was Ed Colin's, like, he knew. Just because he couldn't articulate it didn't mean he didn't know how to do it. He obviously knew how to do it because he executed it, and that was his intent. And then you're thinking about that there. So just because you can't articulate what you're seeing in someone, is that necessarily a problem? I have a question though around that athletics example. My daughter's boyfriend plays cricket. He's a good cricketer. He's in the New Zealand under-19 team, and probably more importantly, he's in my indoor cricket team. And I said to him something like, yeah, we're playing cricket this season. And he went, I was playing indoor, and he went, no, I don't know if it's good for my cricket. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I've heard all this stuff before because I used to love cricket. And the cut shot, I don't know if you've played much indoor cricket, but the cut shot is quite different. You hit it straight down into the ground to bounce it over the fielder's head in front of you and hit the net, and it buys you time to take a run. So it is quite a different shot.
Right.
And he said, that's not good. He's a good batsman. And he said, it's not good for my technique, doing this different shot. And I said to him, my thinking was, because I used to get told that when I was a kid when I was getting good at golf, don't play squash, it's bad for your golf because too much wrist, and don't play tennis because it's bad for your golf because it's too much of something else, and don't play cricket because you'll block every shot. It used to drive me nuts. But I said to him, what if you saw cricket as someone's bowling something at you, a ball, you've got an implement, and your job is just to manipulate your implement to maneuver that ball to wherever it needs to go. So there's no technique for a cut shot. In outdoor, that might mean your cut shot flies 50 meters dead straight to point. It also might mean it goes backward of point. So my challenge to him was, what if instead of looking at it what technique was, of what's the problem you're trying to solve, and it's to use your implement to manipulate that ball to the space it needs to go in, and then is that hurting your technique? We had a stalemate on that, by the way. He wasn't into it. So I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that one.
It's interesting because I was listening to the Psych Show. You probably listen to it a lot. Dan Abraham.
Yeah.
And yeah, he just recently he had Jamie Taylor and another guy on talking about some pedagogy stuff, which I found really interesting. And they were arguing that we need to think more about the nuance of pedagogy as opposed to thinking in black and white, which is very human, and it's becoming more of a thing, the dogma you buy into these days. But so an example was more traditional processing type theory, motor control theory versus the ecological dynamics that a lot of people are talking about these days. And they just argued for that it's actually a continuum, and it depends on stage of learning, and there's much more nuance, which made a lot of sense to me. Listening to your example, I think it would depend on one, like where that player is in their skill level, their stage of learning, based on their ability to take in new information, relate it to what they already know, and then solve the problem that they face, which I think there's enough science to suggest that that's how we learn. But then we can manipulate that in lots of different ways. So if it was a young cricketer who, for example, was starting to learn the cut shot, and then they were learning it outdoors, and then they came in to play some indoor, and then the week after they had to go back outside and play outdoor cricket. Perhaps that indoor experience would be interference or in the way that they process that information, and therefore that learning might be disrupted. And I'm kind of making this up on the spot a little bit because it's brand new in my thinking. Yeah. But if that's a skilled athlete, and in your example, I'm sure that it was, then that variability actually becomes something that's useful, because that interference in the way that he uses new information, relates it to what he already knows, can actually serve as an advantage, and the literature, I think, would back that up. And so playing some indoor on a Tuesday night before going out on Saturday and playing some outdoor actually might do exactly as you suggested, and actually serve to increase his skillfulness so that he can discern better when he sees that ball and decides to put it wherever the fielder isn't. Yeah, so I would suggest that it could be a good thing to place him indoor at that level of skill.
Yeah.
So yeah, like it gets pretty complex, and it just depends on what we're trying to do and who we're working with and where they are in their level of skill, etc., etc. So
I think complex is the key bit there, because everything I think in sport has a level of complexity to it. But as coaches or administrators or as people, I feel like we're always trying to reduce things down to, do these 3 things and everything will be all right, but not understanding that, like there's a whole lot of mental stuff at play with, we don't know what's going on in his head at his time in the cricket. Like, is he struggling for confidence, in which case maybe that wouldn't be beneficial. There's all these layers. Like, it is so complex. But we feel like, and certainly in golf, we're desperate to overlay this formula that, if I do this, then I'll get this outcome. But that acceptance that shit doesn't work like that.
Yeah, for sure. It brings to mind that example you gave really early on of the golfer who blames a negative ball outcome on the swing, and you suggested that, well, what are the other components that potentially might have contributed to that poor outcome? And you've got all this sort of data that you can track based on GPS and et cetera. Have you ever got golfers to narrate what they're thinking and their intention?
Yeah. Yep.
How does what shows up when they do that?
So there's a few things. Is that called thinking aloud? In terms of,
I guess,
the work?
Like it's not an area of literature that I can point to. I'm just curious.
A mate of mine mentioned that as a strategy, thinking aloud. So basically just getting them to verbalize what they're thinking, hence the aptly named process. But so the 2 things that I think are really interesting in golf are, they know what they should be thinking. So they know what to say. So there's that element of it. So in golf, you're not actually allowed to coach while they're playing, in terms of, not allowed to give any technical advice, depending on your definition of coaching, but you're not allowed to coach the golf swing. But I can caddy, in which case I can do whatever I like. And I'll do things like hot and cold conversations. So I'll purposely, again, I've got the relationship with the player, so this is not straight off the cuff, but I'll purposely push buttons with players and go, oh man, what were you thinking there? That was a dumb shot. And then they'll hit back because they'll be a bit angry and emotional. I'll either record what they're saying or make notes about it. It can be more subtle. I remember one example, walking off the 11th tee, and the guy just 3-putted the 10th green and had a bad shot off the 11th tee. And I just casually said, oh, what happened there, mate? And he's like, well, I don't know. And he blamed his swing and he went on this rant. And I was like, oh, yeah, all good, sweet. And anyway, the next morning, I said to him, what do you reckon happened on the 11th tee, mate? And the conversation was completely different. So that, that hot and cold review. And I'd written down in my notebook what he'd said after what he was playing his next shot. And so I read back to him what he told me, he had said the day before. And he's like, yeah, that's just because I was pissed off because I 3-putted the 10th green. And so that was really useful to go, just for him to be aware that how much that emotional stuff can impact. But in terms of the decision-making, the pre-shot stuff, the gold would be to get the player to be vulnerable enough to be open and go, I'm actually really scared about that lake on the right-hand side. Because golf has a massive fear component to it. Despite the fact that no one's chucking a hard missile at you at 150 Ks or 130 K man trying to knock you over, there's a fair bit of fear because it's judgment and, humanness.
Yeah, for sure.
But if you had a player go, I was just really scared of that water on the right or out of bounds on the left, that's when you can start having the goal. But that takes a pretty mentally strong person and a lot of trust in that relationship before they open up like that. But that's when you can start to do some good work. And I mean, that was my experience as a player. I got stuck on a tee. So the New Zealand Open, very first hole, I literally couldn't move. So I froze, paralysis, and people think I'm exaggerating to make a point when I couldn't move, but I literally froze. I forgot how to move. So it was a it was a horrific feeling because it was like I was looking at my hand through someone else's eyes, and I didn't know how to make them start moving. But then I could go to the practice area and hit it fine. And you'd think, well, hold on, what's happening here? Because when I stand on the tee in the tournament, I literally freeze, not every time, but enough times for it to not be very functional, and hit horrendous shots. But I'd go to the practice environment and be fine. No dramas at all. So, even just that awareness of going, and I thought, and my coach would say, oh, it's because of your swing. And I used to think, oh yeah, it must be because of my swing. But no, it was not my swing at all. Oh, it was my swing, but that was the smoke coming out of the house that was on fire. That wasn't the fire that was burning inside it.
So what did you do? Like, I want to further this conversation because I think it's fascinating. But like going back to freezing on the tee, it was for how long were you looking down at your hands without an ability to make them move?
Probably, like I'd say 5 or 10 seconds the first time. So, and then I had to walk away. So in golf, you can, step back. So I did. I stepped away and thought, all right, my heart rate's probably going 200, and I'm thinking, fuck, that's not normal. What just happened there? And then, anyway, stood up again and went, fuck, I don't know what to do. My dad was caddying. It was New Zealand Open, so it was a big event. I was only I don't know how old I was, 18 maybe. And Dad said, what are you doing? I was like, I can't move. He goes, what do you mean you can't move? I said, well, I can't move the club. And of course, if you've never heard that before, he's thinking, fuck, just hit it. You know how to hit it. And I went, yeah, true, good. And so then I walked back up and I backed off again and went, no, I actually don't know what I'm doing, Dad. And I was freaking out because I'm stuck. I can't get my car going, I'm stalling on the... And anyway, he gave me a 3-iron or whatever. He gave me another club. He goes, here, just take the ball off the tee, put it on the ground and just hit 3-iron. So I kind of just walked up, and there's a Parapara Beach Golf Club. And like if your driver goes 250 metres, your 3-iron probably in those days went 180. Well, I chipped this 3-iron off the tee probably 100 metres because that was all I could. I got the club moving and then just went, and I sort of leant on the ball and it went about 100 metres. So incredibly embarrassing experience because by the time you've backed off the ball 3 times, the dude holding the quiet please sign, not that there was a massive gallery around my group, but there was enough people, the dude holding the quiet please signs starting to wonder what's cracking off and people starting to murmur. And yeah, just have this experience of, man, what just happened there? So it was interesting.
Man. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a very visceral experience for you that brings it all alive, doesn't it?
And I think that's why I'm fascinated with it not being the swing now.
Yeah. And I would imagine that like the majority of sports psychs, mental skills coaches, they can talk to these ideas now, and we know that from some FRMI and some neuroscience that they're starting to figure out what is actually happening when these types of experiences are taking place. Where do you think you could have started if you were to rewind the clock a little bit to start generating some awareness for you 3 or 4 years before you stepped up to that tee at Parapara Umu? Going back to, where I get fascinated is that's a crucial piece. Is I think athletes are experiencing those things all of the time. I mean, in life, we experience those things all the time. Now, they're on a continuum. We might not necessarily get to the point where we physically can't move, but 100%, like, they're having their effect.
Yeah.
And how many athletes are just either not picking them up, like zero awareness, or, just accepting that there's nothing really we can do about it. Just move on, right?
Yeah. Well, that's an awesome question because I've not been asked that before. I've been asked, what did you do at the time and what did you do after? But to go 3 years before is interesting. And the thing I think now I would have loved is I was someone who didn't want to get in trouble at school, didn't want to let anybody down, wouldn't break a rule. And I think that's why now I'm attracted to the rule breakers and the mavericks, because I wasn't. And I would love someone then, 3 years prior, to help me understand me and be okay with me. And, you might be different, or, there isn't a way to do this. I was hell-bent on being this, whatever a professional golfer needed to be or was perceived to be. And I was hell-bent on being that rather than being me and, being okay that what I bring is what I've got. And I'd say it manifested in this case, or I don't know if manifested is the word, but it reared its ugly head on the golf course. But I'd say that'd be a consistent theme across my life, and that, like the desire to do things right and, not quite, not play it a bit safe and fit in to the norm. And I would love someone to have challenged me and go, you don't have to do what everybody else does. You can do it your way. There isn't a right way. And I played with a guy that day called Peter Fowler, who's won multiple times in Europe, and had at the time. And after the round, he said, mate, let's go and have lunch. I knew him relatively well. He said, let's go and have lunch. And he just said, what happened there? Oh, I was anxious. I didn't know how to move. And he said to me, that anxiety, he said, that never goes away, mate. We've all got that. And he's a great mate, and he had the best intent. I was a bit of an idiot. And what he was saying was, you're not abnormal. We've all got that. I was trying to hide it and suppress it and pretend it didn't exist. Whereas he was going, mate, we all go through that. Like, it's normal it's part of what being on tour is about. And my thinking was, I don't want to play golf with that much stress. I don't want to live my life. I don't want to spend 30 years as a successful professional making money if it means I've got to go through that. And so even just how that narrative played out in my head, I would love people to have, David Galbraith, who I started my podcast with, who I think's just a brilliant thinker. I would love to have had him around, but would I have been brave enough to do what he asked me to do? I don't know. So, but yeah, 3 years out, I think I would have loved to have known more about me and started to accept me for who I am. And that's still a work on now, and I'm a few years down the track from then.
That stage of adolescence, where we are formulating our identity, for me is so crucial. Because to have someone alongside you during those developmental years, like, I believe it changes the course of somebody's life. And that's where I love your story, and I think there's lots of people that would resonate. Like, I resonate with that, and as you talk to this idea of being drawn to the Mavericks, I'm drawn to the skate park. Now, I didn't grow up with a skateboard anywhere near me.
Yeah.
I was the antithesis of that. Like, I was straight down the middle.
Yeah.
and now I'm the opposite, right? And perhaps it's for a similar reason, because I'm drawn to that as well. But having someone in your corner, who's there as a mentor, but who can draw your attention just to those types of ideas, just to get you thinking with plenty of patience, with no desire to change anything in the moment, but over time, the opposite of that could happen. Just would be super fascinating, and I think I'm just curious as to where you think that might be able to come into the experience of young people in sport, because that's where sport for me starts living up to its true potential of, I'm here to help you discover yourself. And that's like, if sport can do that, then wow.
Yeah.
We're actually changing lives.
Do you know where I think we've got a real gold nugget, and someone who I reckon, I don't know, have you met Christian Penny? He works
No.
for HPSNZ. I reckon you'd get a lot out of having a chat with him. So he was at Toi Whakaari, New Zealand Drama School. He was director of that. Now I'm not sure what his title is at HPSNZ, but it's something to do with coach development. And apologies, Christian, for not knowing your title, but a great man. And he has this belief that the tikanga or the Tau Māori processes have so much to offer and could be a real gold nugget for New Zealand sport if we saw them as so we did a thing with Coach Accelerator program where we spent 5 days on Manatuka Marae, and they took us through these processes, and they kept on saying, see these as engineering processes, not cultural processes. So don't see it as a Māori process, see it as a way to engage. And I reckon there is so much gold in that space that if we could bring that into our everyday life, I mean, even just the first part of coming together with a group of people on a marae, there's the process of welcoming, and then you speak, and that's part of it, to say where you are and where you're coming from. And if we could be more open in that space, and if that became more normal for us, then I think we wouldn't have these, not robots, but these clones that are, these academies that are producing these little mini professionals. We'd have these people who understand themselves. And I reckon there's some real gold in that process and bringing that process to life.
Yeah, awesome. I've dug into the very surface of some of those ideas, and they definitely resonate. And as you referred to them as engineering processes, I love that so much. For me, a lot of that is just very human. It makes a lot of sense to me, and yeah, like being able to bring that into the space of what we're doing. And for me, that's about possibility. Like, I always have this thought that we're leaving so much on the table, and if we thought a little bit differently of in some of the ways that we do things, then we could get more people to really get something out of the the sporting way, but also take them to even greater heights, which is pretty cool, eh?
You should get him on your podcast, I reckon.
Yeah, I've got his name down. I'll be sending him an email tomorrow.
Honestly, he's even for general chat, and the way that he thinks about things is strong.
The challenge, I think, is it's the integration into a system that doesn't necessarily have the specific placeholder for it. Like that is the challenge. The biggest challenge that I have is the time and the energy and the space and the resource for change, because that's a real challenge when the majority of the time we're kind of just living in the moment to make sure that stuff is happening. That the kids are in the van, and that the game starts on time. I mean, we did a thing. We had a coaching thing with HPSNZ up in Matakana a couple of weeks ago, and that whole process or concept of slowing down to go fast, or slow down to speed up, and to get us into it, there was a couple of new coaches who were being brought in, and so he split the room into two groups and went, the new coaches and the old, and you had time to say how you were feeling. And like, I was one of the new coaches, so I could stand up and go, I'm feeling a bit anxious about this, like I don't know you people. I feel I'm out of my depth in terms of the group that I'm with, that I'm looking at. So, there's a bit of anxiety around what these next few days hold for me. And then the next group get up and they give a reply about what they see in you. And that process, which, you potentially feel like, we just not wasted 2 hours or whatever it is. But
that then allowed us to connect on such a deeper level, and we could actually then get into some really good work, and we missed all the surface stuff that can often sit in those spaces. And so not at one point did you think like, we never felt like we were on a marae, or it didn't feel like it was a Māori thing. It just felt like Christian took the time for us to be seen and for us to be allowed to be seen. And it just made a massive difference to what I think we achieved over the few days.
Yeah, I love it. It goes back to a larger idea in life where, or the culture that we're living in the modern area, where everybody's rushing, everybody's, running from one thing to the next, and the badge of honor is I'm busy.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard plenty of people talk about it before, but it becomes just the standard answer. And sometimes someone will ask me how I am, and before I even get a chance to say anything, they'll answer it for me. Are you busy?
Yeah.
I'm like, oh man, if that's the standard answer, we're all in so much trouble.
Yeah.
Because, if we all think we're that busy, then what are we actually doing to get better?
Yeah. I did an interesting thing. A mate of mine said, have you heard of the book, The 12-Hour Walk? And he sent me a text, and I said, no, I haven't. And he said, oh, you should get it. It's a good book. Anyway, I thought, I wonder if the guy's done a podcast. So he had, and I listened to it. And the premise was, this is last week, I listened to this. Premise was, walk out your front door, walk for 12 hours, turn your phone off onto flight mode, go by yourself, and just walk. You can walk 1 mile or 50 miles. It's American. You can walk 1 mile or 50 miles. Doesn't matter. It's not about that. It's just about disconnecting and taking time. And so I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. So on Sunday morning, I left home at 6:30 in the morning, had a bag full of fruit and a couple of sandwiches and some water. And I just walked 55 Ks in 12 hours, just went for a walk, no phone, no music, no podcasts, nothing. It's just you and your thoughts. And man, it was a powerful thing to do. It was really interesting, and I'd recommend people to give it a crack. But to your point there of being busy, you realize, certainly I don't know about everyone's going to, but you sort of realize how much noise there is in your life that's just often self-inflicted noise and doesn't actually need to be there. So that could be a good thing, mate, if you ever probably young family might be a bit harder to get the 12 hours away, but I'd recommend that to help with that.
That's a cool idea. It might be a good way to bring this conversation to an end too. Just let us know what came to light in that 12 hours, Jay.
Quite a few things actually, but the first thing was I was surprised at how hard. I didn't think it would be that hard to walk for 12 hours, but I was bloody sore by the end of it.
It's a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time.
It's probably like 11 and a half hours longer than what is normal.
Yeah, yeah. You can stop and rest and stuff, but probably exactly to your point, which triggered it for me, was the busyness of our mind. Like there were times where I remember walking along Mount Beach and looking back, I'd walked up and over the mount, and I turned around and went, holy shit, the mount's a long way away now, and I don't really remember any of that, but I've obviously having teleported there, so I've obviously walked it. But just that feeling of calm and peace around within your mind. And then I guess for me, the thing that sort of stood out was my connection with people is critically important for me. And my phone, I think, plays a real part in inhibiting that also for me. It can help with connection. It's how I connected with you, obviously, through the digital media, but it also plays a massive part in inhibiting my ability or potential to connect with people. And so that was probably the biggest realization of starting to reflect on how important it is for me to connect. And even things like you'll be talking to someone, and people with Apple Watches now, and they'll get a text message and you'll be mid-conversation, and then they'll get a text and look down at their watch and you've lost them, and just the disconnect that you feel when someone does that. And then I'm aware that, man, I must do things like that as well. So yeah, probably the human connection was the big thing that came to life for me. And I didn't think it would be as hard as it was.
Oh, it's like anything, isn't it? if you'd been walking up until that point, it probably would have been, as they say, a walk in the park. But anything that we do without a bit of training gets a little bit challenging. But I love it. I mean, I think that idea of just simply finding ways to connect, like on a deep level, to the people that we spend time with is a pretty good starting place, isn't it? Be it with our friends and our family, or the kids or the athletes that we coach. Pretty important.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, this has been fun, Jay. Like, it's definitely been a little bit different to the standard athlete development show, but I've enjoyed it. So I appreciate you taking some time and being up for a bit of a yarn.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Love the show too, man. So keep it up.
Kia ora.